Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In 2022, Counterweight, the organization that Helen Pluckrose founded and that was absorbed into the Institute for Liberal Values, had a virtual conference on alternatives to diversity and inclusion. Starting in 2025, we will be rolling out one talk a month that was presented at the conference. We sit down with the original presenters throughout 2025 to see what has changed since 2022. With diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives seemingly on the chopping block, we are curious to hear what our original participants are witnessing and experiencing on the ground. Is DEI really dead or just in remission? Are there healthy alternatives to DEI that we should consider, or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and wipe our hands clean? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. This month, Jennifer Richmond interviews Will Reusch. In his update to his original talk on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion, where he shared practical tips for difficult conversations and communicating across divides, Will shares with us his latest work on how to brainwash-proof kids. Despite DEI being on the wane across America, Will tells us that they are now too often baked into K-12 academic standards, making them more difficult to dismiss. As education becomes more decentralized with the rise of new school opportunities, Will is taking the momentum to move education from an obedience model that values compliance over curiosity with his own online courses. His ultimate aim in creating Patterdox is the pursuit of truth that rewards curiosity and critical thinking. Will Reusch, welcome to the Dissidents Podcast. We are here to talk to you about, now, if you recall, back in 2023, you did a presentation for Counterweight on diversity and inclusion. And I'm here to see kind of what you're doing now, an update from that talk that you gave, which, we will also make available on the Dissidents Podcast. But I'm going to highlight a few things that you talked about back in 2023. Now, I remember back in 2023, things are quite hot for you. You had been on a couple of podcasts, openly almost attacked, if you were. I don't want to be too, dramatic, but you took some beatings there, and you shared a little bit of that in your original talk. And one of the things that I have to say about you that was so refreshing about your talk is you gave practical tips for dealing with how to have these difficult conversations and around diversity and inclusion. And a lot of them were, again, so practical, but people were getting so wrapped up in the conversation that they kind of forgot to back down or back away and actually, address some of the practicality that you offered. And I'm going to repeat some of the things that you said. You said, refer to the standards, right? So many of the things that were being taught, actually, they didn't even, apply to the standards of the school district. And so just simply saying, hey, where does this apply to the standards was a question that a lot of people weren't going back and looking. So that was a really good practical tip. You mentioned How to Have Impossible Conversations. That's the book with Peter Boghossian and Jim Lindsay. Great book. I've heard you mention it more than once, so I know that you're a fan of that book. And that really helped you to learn how to communicate across divides. But then the other thing that you brought out, which I love, is Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind, and talking about how we have different values. And so if you understand the value of the person that you're speaking with, you can speak to that value, and the conversations aren't always necessarily at loggerheads. So those were some of the practical tips that you gave in 2023 to the Counterweight Diversity and Inclusion Conference. With that, a few questions before we get started, because I know you're going to talk, you've got some new work coming out on it's not how to brainwash how to de-brainwash your kids.
Brainwash-proof your kids, yeah.
Brainwash-proof your kids. So I know you've been working on a lot of stuff since we last spoke around these issues. But let me first start by saying it's 2025. It's 2 years after we did the first talk. I think back then, diversity and inclusion was a hot topic. I think we saw a lot of schools in a frenzy to adopt various curricula around DEI initiatives. And so we were all kind of wondering, and the purpose of the conference itself was, how do we do diversity and inclusion? We took equity out of the title of the Counterweight conference, but how do we do diversity and inclusion where it's not divisive? And again, how I introduced your presentation was your response. Two questions for you. The first is, 2 years later, would you have said or done anything different from your original presentation? Did you miss anything?
I think at the time it was good. I think that now there have been standards that have been implemented. So when I said that just 2 years ago, the standards were much more academically focused, and now there's more and more. I mean, there are a few like the Seattle math, standards and stuff like that, but there are more and more now that the standards include elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, I threw equity in there, but like that's happening more in standards. So when I say point to the standards, that gets a little bit screwy now. In certain districts and certain school environments or in private schools, like a lot of private schools have these like, mantras and these commitments to DEI. I mean, most of them do. So that technique wouldn't work, where I think when I said that even just 2 years ago, they didn't have that. But because it became such a hot button issue, that now schools are like, all right, well, we have to be very, very public about how we're devoted to this kind of thinking. But as far as how to have difficult conversations, that still holds up. And I think that, just being able to engage in viewpoint diversity is really important. And that's the John Haidt moral foundations thing, is once you see that we're not more moral or less moral, we're differently moral. So if I can just jump right in to like one of the biggest third rail topics, okay? Segments of the population see it as life-saving, gender-affirming care. Other segments of the population see it as extremely dangerous, life-threatening, gender-affirming harm. It's the same thing. It's the same procedure, but the way that they see it. And one of the moral foundations is care and harm.
Right.
So they see it from complete opposite ends. And once you understand that it's not that they're bad people, I don't care what side you're on, they are differently moral and they see the same thing from very different perspectives. And once you can acknowledge that, then you don't attack them as much and you more go into leaning into understanding, sharing why you that you have, maybe they have certain information, and poke holes in their information, they'll poke holes in yours, and you can have some sort of dialogue. And I do believe that that's the way forward.
And that still stands up. This idea of moral foundations, I think, is one of the most brilliant ideas. But you just said something I wanted to go back to before I get to my second question is, I work with a psychologist, part of ILV, who talks about how when standards change, what's really hard is backing away from that. So let me make sure I heard you right. So if we've changed academic standards to include DEI and some of the harmful versus careful or whatever aspects of DEI, even now as we're starting to realize some of the damage of DEI or the way it was actually implemented, to kind of roll that back so that the standards no longer uphold that, that's going to be a whole different trial, right?
It's going to be very difficult. And I had a conversation with John Haidt about this probably around the same time I did that. So probably like 2023. And he's like, I think we've hit peak woke and I think it's going to start to pull away. And I was like, what you don't seem to understand is that they built departments, DEI departments, and people have jobs and salaries in the education system. And once those things are built, they're very hard to dismantle because those are people's jobs, their livelihood, and their job hinges on this being a problem. You solve the problem, then they don't have a job anymore. It's like the Save the Pandas Foundation. Well, pandas numbers are thriving. It's like, what are you going to do? How are we going to raise money? What about all these people that, out there counting pandas and stuff? Like it's strange to have an organization or a business whose goal is to go out of business. But that's kind of the situation that we have. And I think it's going to be very difficult. And whether it's moving the goalpost or whatever it is, I think it's going to be very difficult to undo that. I don't know it's kind of like what's kind of going on in the government right now with all of these executive agencies. So we have like 400 different executive agencies and organizations that are like under the executive branch. more we have more agencies than we've had like years of this country. And it's because once you build one, they tend to not dismantle it. They build one, they bring people in, they have jobs, and then they just keep going and going and going, and it keeps growing. It's very easy to grow organizations that are like government, aligned. It's very hard to shrink them. And when you do shrink them, then people don't like it. And I think that's an element of kind of the stuff that's happening right now in current events.
And I think, also, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an educator in this same way that you are, but we've seen some colleges dismantle their DEI, fire people like you were saying, but what we're not seeing, I don't think, is where that has impacted K through 12 education. I don't think we're seeing that same kind of reaction in K through 12 education.
No, I think that there's an awareness of the people, of the citizens now about it, but what's happening at the school level is they still have created these departments and standards, and they haven't dismantled that yet. Again, because the optics, if you're not educated on what DEI actually looks like in practice, then the idea of dismantling DEI sounds really bad. You want to get rid of diversity? You want to not include people? You know what I mean? Like that sounds terrible. And you're dealing with with a lot of the population who just don't know the nuance. They go based on the name of things. This thing says anti-racist. So you're against anti-racism. So you're a racist. Like it's just like there's so many things that we're all ignorant about. And this just happens to be something that I'm educated on and you're educated on, but we're ignorant about a million different things. So when something gets, sounds bad, we're just going to jump to that it is bad without kind of peeling the onion. And I think that's what's happening with the K through 12. If a private school, but especially government schools, say they're going to get rid of things that have to do with diversity and inclusion, that sounds really bad.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of takes me to my second question is, what are you seeing now? I think we kind of jumped into that with your response on standards, including DEI. And I know your work now kind of touches on what we're talking about insofar as you have a workshop now out on how to not brainwash your child or brainwash-proof your child.
Yeah.
And I will, for our audience listening, I will give links to how you can access, Will, your full workshop there. But lead me through that. Like, what is your work really focusing on now?
So I think what's happening is because of everything that happened in, from the summer of 2020 all the way up through, the CRT talk and then the DEI talk and all of that kind of stuff. COVID mixed with parents listening into classrooms going, whoa, what's going on? Is if you see the trends, a lot of people are pulling their kids out of public school. So they're going into homeschooling, unschooling, or smaller co-ops or independent schools. So the trend seems to be, and I think this is a trend that's ongoing. People are talking more about the Department of Education and K through 12 education than I can ever remember. It's like 20 years in education. And I think what it's leading to is a decentralizing of the education system. I think that we're not going to just everything goes to these city schools, your zip code school, all these kids, these massive big institutions that are run just because of the numbers. It's nothing like, I'm not vilifying them. I'm just saying, because if you have 2,000, 2,500, 4,000 students in a building, you got to keep things pretty strict. And that leads to the obedience models. And that leads to, running it kind of like a prison, because you can't have all these teenagers going crazy. And I think that we're moving away from that into a more decentralized system of education. So I saw that trend and I go, okay, so people are pulling their kids out of school. What are they going to be teaching them? What are they going to be giving them? Like that creates a vacuum and a need for what to teach these kids. So that's why I built Patterdox, which is, my online education platform. It's a supplemental platform. Patterdox is the name, is like dox is belief, and then the belief in pattern and pattern recognition. So it's social science through understanding patterns and big picture stuff. It's not about memorizing dates and facts. It's about like understanding things through a critical thinking lens. And brainwash-proofing your kids is a way to help parents to not have their kids be indoctrinated. And this is happening. I know a lot of this, is like, it seems like it's an attack on the left. I'm in California, so like there's some like crazy stuff happening in California schools. But I'm friends with teachers who teach in Florida, and a lot of stuff with like the book lists and things like that are pretty extreme in the other direction. I'm friends with an English teacher, and she's like, I was told I couldn't teach Romeo and Juliet because it had like sexual undertones and stuff. So I think it's just this idea. I don't think we should be banning anything. I think that what we should do is teaching kids how to think. So you want to teach critical race theory ideas? Okay, but you have to allow your students to give proper pushback. And what Brainwash-proof for your kids is really all about is getting them to understand how to ask the proper questions and how to think critically so that you aren't going to just be, buying whatever is kind of sold you hook, line, and sinker.
Well, tell me, I know you've got a workshop on it. Run us through a little bit of it.
Yeah, can I share some of it?
Absolutely, please.
All right. So this is just kind of how I open it up. The American education system is an obedience model that exchanges curiosity for compliance. And as I said, a lot of that is just a logistical thing. Okay. But I've been in the education system, so I've seen this. I've seen this over and over and over again. So the American education system, as I said, is a lot of this where people go in and then you lose things like creativity and discipline and a lot of intelligence to come out at the other end of this machine. And, there's these cartoons, that tend to resonate with people. Like, you all have to think this way. We've heard those quotes about, the education system judges all animals by how they can climb a tree and things along those lines. Neurodivergent kids, struggle a lot in school. Kids with dyslexia struggle a lot in school, and then they thrive in the world. They become entrepreneurs. They're super successful. So what's going on? How many stories do we hear about people who were terrible in school and tremendously successful in life? So what's going on there? There's something off. The standard education system. Jordan Peterson talks about this idea that it's a Prussian model that was adopted by Rockefeller and the people who were deemed as like robber barons at the time to build obedient factory workers. So this is just like a really short clip.
I did some investigation into the derivation of the American public education system and found out that it was based on the Prussian model. And the Prussians produced a universal education system in the late 1800s because they were afraid they were losing military superiority, and they wanted to produce a cadre of mindless, obedient soldiers. That was expressly the purpose. And then that model was adopted by prototypical fascists in the US, again in the late 1800s. This is before Mussolini and all of that time. Corporate types mostly who wanted to produce cadres of obedient workers. And that's why the desks are in rows, and that's why there's factory bells, and that's why it's top-down leadership. What was really stunning about that wasn't only that that was the model, but it's worse than that, because the people who built the schools were consciously aiming at eradicating the will of the students who were part of the system because they wanted them to be obedient.
So we can't ignore that that's how it started. Elon Musk, said he school was torture for him. Obviously, he's a brilliant guy, successful. Okay. But he also said that it's very difficult to do something about it. It's kind of, I've talked to, really smart people, Eric Weinstein, people like that. And they're like, it's like getting like the education system fixed. It's like getting salt out of the ocean. It's so kind of ingrained in the way that America does things. So this is not a place for critical thinkers. What's that?
Well, and Elon Musk has started a new school called Ad Astra. It's very secretive right now, but it's outside of Austin, Texas. And anyways, sidebar.
Yeah. I think he's associated with Synthesis too, the math program in some way, or SpaceX's. But that's not a place full of critical thinkers, and our brains aren't even designed to be critical thinkers. So it's something we're not innate to just like question the people around us. We're built to go along with the tribe, so we don't get ostracized and go out and get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So we have to be taught how to think critically. And it's just not done. And if you ask most teachers around the country, they're going to say, oh, I teach critical thinking. But as soon as you tap into one of those third rail issues and emotions get at play, then it goes right out the window. Okay. Now, going against the status quo is scary. You give pushback to something like CRT or gender ideology or something along those lines. It's scary. John Lewis said, never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. But people are scared. Teachers are scared to talk about this stuff. They know that putting biological men in women's prisons probably isn't a great idea, or should at least be discussed. But they're so scared to say something because being called a transphobe, or if you bring up a statistic that has to do with race that's inconvenient, then you get labeled a racist. And teachers are a soft-hearted lot, and we don't want to be labeled those things. It's scary to be labeled those things, so people just keep their mouths shut. But what I always found really interesting, Jennifer, is as a history teacher, is I'd be like, come in, sit down, do what you're told, do what you're told, do what you're told. Now let's learn about American heroes. Let's learn about world heroes. And over and over and over again, it's the people that didn't do what they were told. Martin Luther King was arrested 29 times. Rosa Parks, follow the rules. No. American hero. You know what I mean? Like Nelson Mandela didn't, Gandhi, Jesus, revolutionary, went against the Jewish law, killed for it. Socrates, stop asking all these questions. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. So I just found it very interesting. I think teenagers are so astute. I love working with teenagers. Like, they pick up on this. They're great BS detectors. And like, so we're going to learn about all these rebels, but you're going to tell me, don't be a rebel. And I think that we have to be willing to push back. And I think part of like brainwash-proofing your kids is having the courage to ask the questions that I'm going to propose and take some of the actions that you're going to propose. And you might get labeled bad names. You're not going to get literally crucified. You're not going to have to drink hemlock. Probably not going to go to jail. There could be some consequences, though. I'm not denying that. There could be. And some of those might be rolled eyes. They could be also things like threats to your livelihood or your job. So I'm not discounting that. And I recognize that that's what's keeping people so silent. And if you want to brainwash proof your kids, what you need to do is have the courage to be able to push back. So this isn't just on one side. In Louisiana, they had a law to post the 10 Commandments. Okay, so that's clearly brainwashing into one direction, because not everyone follows the 10 Commandments. But then also the Black Lives Matter, rainbow flag kind of elements that we see a lot on libs of TikTok and things that's happening too. But I don't want this just to be like an anti-left thing. This is something that all parents should be aligned with. Is we want our kids to be critical thinkers. We don't want them to be indoctrinated. Okay, it is happening in schools. It is absolutely happening in schools. So these books, like gender queer, the stuff that's in these books, they are in schools. Not a lot of them, but how much of them should there be? There should be zero. Okay. Or if it should be for developmentally appropriate and spoken about in the right way at the very least. But, there's book bans, and these are things that need to be discussed. It can't just be like ban the books or don't ban the books. It's like, how are we going to wrestle with these ideas is something that I think is really, really important. So a lot of these LGBTQ books that have been banned, I think need to be discussed more. And I think that there needs to be professional development about how to discuss them, instead of just blindly saying, follow, teach these books, teach the banned books, which is what some people say, teach them if they're banned, or ban these books because it's indoctrination. It's like, no, let's have conversations. And I'm obviously a big conversation person, but objectivity is, sometimes seen as racist, which we're seeing with the banning of standardized tests because of the achievement gap. Okay, so this stuff is happening in schools. When people say like kids aren't being brainwashed, it's not happening. We saw this with at the Smithsonian from the African American History Museum, all this stuff that was deemed as like white, things like objective linear thinking, like showing up on time, working hard, winning, like this was crazy. Okay, this is stuff that like the Ku Klux Klan would say, but this was something that was posted at the Smithsonian African American History Museum. And that, permeates through the education system as well, if we're talking about museum. The response has been to remove ideas. Okay, so Texas had this like stop woke thing. Like, I understand. It's like, let's remove these ideas. I personally tend to lean into, let's not remove them. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about these ideas. And I don't think, like, as an educator, I don't want kids to do what I tell them to do. I want them to understand that what I'm, like, let's just say, telling them to do, how to live a life. I want them to recognize that this is good for them. I want them to get there on their own. And I don't want them just to do it because they're kind of just told to do it, because the same thing happens here. We're just going to ban these ideas. That doesn't necessarily help them to contend with them when they do come up, maybe at a university or something. So I have a track record of being able to do this. This was like a conversation that kind of went viral that I had with 3 critical race theory teachers. I think everyone should watch this video, not because of me, but because I think it shows the real dangers of this kind of thinking. This was a couple of years ago, and since then, all of these people have gained positions of power in education. One of them is now the dean of a college of education at University of New Hampshire. One of them is on the school board in Atlanta. The other one is making a lot of money doing talks in professional development. So by no means is this like not a thing anymore. But what I did was I gave them a lot of room to talk. And what they said was pretty startling. And I think that most parents around the country who are reasonable, even center left, would go, oh, this is not an approach that I would want, because all I did was ask questions, and it was the questions that upset them. And that's when I was told by people in this conversation that the Socratic method is toxic, that by educators is something that I think we need to pay attention to. A lot of people don't understand critical race theory, but I do, and it's not just rare or fringe. It shows up over and over and over again. That's what Libs of TikTok kind of did. There's like, you could say it's fringe, but eventually you go, okay, there's enough of this around here. And I have parents who come to me who don't know I'm like talking about this stuff, like the CRT, anti-woke stuff. They just know I'm a teacher. Okay, so it could be like family, friends, or like family members. They don't know that I have an Instagram. They don't know I have a podcast. And they just go, you're a teacher. My daughter came home and was told these kinds of things. Did you know that that's happening? And I've heard that over and over again from people that don't know that I'm even in the space. I'm like, yeah, no, it's definitely happening. Gender issues are still being sorted out. Minnesota to require teachers to affirm transgender ideology. California Senate approves ban on requiring schools to notify parents of child's pronoun change. This stuff is all fairly recent. You can look at a statistic here from Pew. Among teachers, the belief that you can be different from the sex you were assigned at birth. 33% of teachers and 45% of high school teachers believe that you could be, saying that students should learn whether someone is a boy or a girl, that being a boy or a girl can be different from what you were assigned at birth. Okay. If you want to believe that, that's okay. But if you're going to present that as a fact, you're a science teacher, or you're a teacher that students assume that teachers are telling them what's true. It's one thing to just have an opinion. You can believe whatever you want. But if you are presenting this as fact, that's where we get into an issue, because clearly we have not sorted this out yet. We have a language issue about gender. The ideological leaning of K through 12 is something that we have to look at. If we're talking about Jonathan Haidt talks about viewpoint diversity a lot. You can see the NEA spent over $92 million on political contributions, and 97% went to Democrats. Okay, so the entire world of education is more left-leaning, and there's nothing wrong with being left-leaning, but there is a problem of lack of balance. And that's the problem, okay? If it was the other direction, I think it would be a problem too. Mm-hmm. I think Democrats need Republicans, and Republicans need Democrats, conservatives need liberals, etc. And then you come together and you wrestle with ideas. So one of the model teachers would be a National Teacher of the Year, Sydney Chaffee. I had her on my podcast a couple of years ago. And I want you to listen to how many times she says in this conversation, because I was trying to help her steelman her position. Starman, as our friend Angel Eduardo would say, give her the benefit of the doubt, and say, like, I think representation is important, and making sure that little black girls have people to look up to that are successful, in non-traditional ways from what they've typically seen. And her response, I want you to hear what she's talking about with collectivism, because James Lindsay wrote a book on the Marxification of education. and this idea that like Marxist ideas have found their way into education. Well, she was deemed as the best teacher in the country. And I'm going to play this clip because of how often she talks about this. And this is her kind of defending her position, the, National Teacher of the Year, defending her position. Listen to the way she talks about collectivism, whether she knows it or not. Collectivism is a huge part of Marxism. And I want you to listen to this.
In terms of talking about social justice, what I just heard you say is that social justice is about making sure that everyone feels valued and everyone feels important and all of that. And I think that that's true, but I also think that there's a facet of social justice that's very much not about the individual. It's about the collective. It's about society, right? And so I think if we think about teaching social justice as only about let's make sure all of the individuals feel good about themselves, I think we're missing a sort of critical piece that we need our kids to understand, which is that social justice is about making our society a more just place as a collective. It's about making sure that we as a collective are better, and that as a collective we're taking care of one another, and we are fully benefiting from what's bring to our society. And that's, again, I'm sort of like fumbling through the language there, but I think sometimes, especially with kids who grow up with a lot of privilege, like myself, right? I grew up white and middle class and was really privileged in a lot of ways. I grew up, I know you talked to Mandy Manning, the 2018 Teacher of the Year, about how the educational system is sort of built on white ideals, which I agree with. And so I was very privileged in the way that I experienced education and the way that I benefited from education, all of that. I think people like me who grow up with that kind of privilege, we understand the world and society through a very individualistic lens, right? And it's it's a characteristic of white society to be very individualistic and focused on the individual and focused on individual success. But I think that pushing back on that a little bit with kids as well and with ourselves to thinking about what is the role of the collective, why is the collective important, and why is it a good thing for all of us if the collective, if our society is more equitable for all individuals, I think is something that's really good for us to explore with kids.
You said it 7 times, and which is a major part of a Marxist theory. So I think like a lot of these kinds of ideas, they sound good, but what do they look like in practice? What does that mean? What does that mean? So James Lindsay talks about this in his book, The Marxification of Education, that it's really got its grip in education. NBC News, American school teachers aren't the Marxist cabal. Well, the National Teacher of the Year, I'm not saying she's a Marxist, I'm saying she's saying things that are deeply aligned with Marxist thinking, and the amount of stuff that's going on here, it does have those elements of it. So we have to be aware of the way that indoctrination is happening. I think they're just ignorant. I think they just don't know what's happening. And Marxist ideas should be taught, but they should be taught so you can see it. So they should be taught about what it is, not to do it, but you should know what it is. You should know what it is. I mean, people learn about Nazism all the time, which is why they call everyone a Nazi, but they don't learn about the Soviet experience. They don't learn about Maoist China. It's not in a lot of schools. So I think that's important. It's why we have the classics like 1984 and Brave New World, is so we can learn from them,
I was just speaking to a DOE rep the other day who pretty much echoed everything you just said about Teachers of the Year and not understanding some of the basic principles around U.S. civics, for example, or around like Marxist or neo-Marxist or collectivist thought in Teachers of the Year. So it's funny to hear you now say that when I just had this conversation the other day. So you're not alone in your observation.
Yeah, thank you. They're not applying the lessons. Yuri Bezmenov, who was, he was a propagandist for Soviets. This is really quick, but here's what he says.
Education. Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, Anything, as long as it takes you away. Okay?
So part of the plan of the Soviet Union, this long plan that he kind of devised was, let's get away from the things that are really core of education, like mathematics and physics. And well, look at the test scores. Like that's happening. And you could say like, well, no, that's just a coincidence. Maybe, correlation is not causation. I understand, but there's a lot here to all this. I think there's value in learning about this stuff. I've taught Howard Zinn in my class, but it's always through a lens where we're able to criticize it. We're able to dive into it, and I understand that these things are emotional. It can lead to a lot of cancel culture and conflict. And I think that's, why people tend not to do it, should we be canceling these teachers too? I think that's an issue. This teacher was removed after students pledged allegiance to a pride flag. She didn't have an American flag. So she's like, well, you can pledge allegiance to that one if you want, like making a joke. And she was fired. And I think that we have to have grace towards these teachers too, because a lot of them just don't know what they're doing, and or they're just going really they're just trying their best. It's not easy. It's not an easy job. So the last video I want to show you is this Riverside teacher was fired after her dancing in mock Native American headdress. Okay, so this was cancel. This is cancel culture from the right, saying like, this woke teacher, get her out of there. And then this one is cancel culture from the left. So people were coming together to protest this teacher who was mocking Native Americans. Now I want to show you this because SOHCAHTOA is a mnemonic device for trigonometry, like sine, cosine, tangent stuff. Mm-hmm. Now this teacher, I just feel for her so much because what she's trying to do is get her teenage students to just pay attention. We are dancing monkeys up there. Whatever I got to do to get them to learn, I'm going to do it. And it's tough. Kids are tough. Teenagers are tough critics. So she gets up there and she is acting silly to get them to remember SOHCAHTOA. Okay. And I want you to say this. Now, she was fired from her job for this, but she is just like out there making a fool of herself. She has no ill intent. She's not trying to mock Native Americans. Like, what is going on here? But this one's really heartbreaking for me, actually. And this is, and I feel for her. I wouldn't do something like this, but I feel for her.
Okay. SOHCAHTOA, 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 SOHCAHTOA.
Okay, like that just broke my heart. Like she was just trying to like be silly, and it's like, oh, it's an opportunity. It's like this like victimhood, this opportunity to kind of take her down. So, being a teacher is so scary because if you're worried about doing that and getting fired, then you're definitely not going to bring up anything that would be in the culture war. It's like, I'm just going to stay away from this. So I understand the feeling that a lot of teachers have. Teachers just can't give their honest thoughts on a lot of things. Teachers, they teach ideology as fact. That's a problem. And they don't allow for critical thinking on issues that deny humanity or issues that they feel are like emotionally charged or that they're connected to. Okay. So.
Well, what I'm getting from this above and beyond, the first presentation that you made is, of course, our theme at the time was diversity and inclusion, and some of the perhaps brainwashing or uncritical thinking around those themes. But what I see you kind of pull back in this, how to brainwash-proof your kids, is something I think very interesting. And I think that you hit on something incredibly important. Neo-Marxist thought is kind of what led, or at least opened the door to a lot of the D&I ideologies. A lot of these divisive ideologies were cultivated or even, what's the word I want to use? They were fuel to fire to neo-Marxist trends and whatnot. And so for us to see the trend in the first place, to see how then D&I kind of latched onto that trend. But one of the things that you mentioned in this presentation that I find fascinating, and I've heard this before, is that education itself was not meant to make critical thinkers. We talk so much about critical thinking, the importance of critical thinking,
Right.
or where there's critical thinking is lacking in the classroom, particularly around D&I issues, but it wasn't meant to have critical thinkers. It was meant to have worker bees.
Yeah. It's not even great at that, honestly, because of the way they've lowered standards and things like that. Like now you got to show up on time to a job at McDonald's. Like, so it's not even making great worker bees.
Mm.
You know?
So let me ask you this. I asked Ellie Avishai what she did an update on her counterweight presentation. And I said, what is the purpose of education? So we know original education, the Prussian model, create obedience over, compliance over curiosity. That's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to write that into the show notes too. But what should education in America be? What should its purpose be?
Oh my gosh. Education in America is about figuring out what is true. It's the pursuit of truth, which is, it seems like a cliche, but it's the pursuit of truth. And if you're pursuing truth, then you need to keep an open mind because it can get very, very complicated or it can be very simple. But I think education needs to be the pursuit of truth and understanding what do you do once you have that truth. And then it can be elements of morality and all of that. But I think at the end of the day, education needs to be the pursuit of truth, which is why some of these ideas within like DNI or CRT or whatever you want to call it, the postmodernist stuff, which believes fundamentally in no objective truth, is so antithetical to education. Because education needs to be the pursuit of what is true. Because if you're trying to be successful in the world, you're trying to make the world a better place, you're trying to do whatever you want to do to live a purpose-filled life, it has to be rooted in truth. And I think that education at the end of the day is about truth. And me as a social science but critical thinking teacher is not telling them here's what's true. It's telling them here's how you find truth. Here's how you do it. And that's what I do on Patterdox as well.
Well, good work. Thank you, Will.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.